Okay, good morning. Steve Krug and I collectively have about 70 years experience in K-12 design. Our goal today is to give an introduction to the PlanCon process, and PlanCon is an acronym for Planning and Construction Workbook. We'll get into that momentarily. Our goal is to review 6 items. I'll be reviewing with you the choices a school board has to proceed with a project. I will briefly talk about the history of PlanCon, and then I'll review the current steps of PlanCon, a process that takes 11 steps and typically takes anywhere from 1 year to 18 months to just get through the design process and the PlanCon process. Then I'll be turning over the presentation to Steve, and he will talk about what we perceive are some of the problems with PlanCon. And then Steve's next topic will be what we perceive are some of the solutions to PlanCon. Then lastly, I'll close with some recommended changes that we feel might be important for school construction issues such as prevailing wage rates, etc. So in terms of the choices a school district has to do a project, as everyone I think knows, there's 500 school districts in Pennsylvania. Each one has 9 school board members. And what happens is the school board and or the administration decides that perhaps they need to do a building project, and that's determined by perhaps the age of the building, the conditions of the building, increasing or decreasing enrollment projections, and community needs, those type of issues. So after they decide that they would like to look at their entire school district, they interview architects and hire an architect. And the architect performs the facility studies. The architect must review all buildings owned by the school district, not only the educational buildings, but also maintenance facilities, athletic facilities, etc. And that study must address, as per Department of Education requirements, capacities of each building, the condition of each building, the enrollment projections, etc. And based upon these parameters, the architect gives their perspective on construction options to resolve these issues. The options could be 3 options. They could be as many as 20 options, depending upon the complexity of the school district and the size of the school district. And the goal of each option is to provide an environment for students and teachers to do their best. So after the study is complete, the architect presents it to the school board and the community, and the school board and administration decide which option they would like to proceed with. Now, if they don't proceed with an option, they may choose to do what's called a capital project, which might mean a boiler replacement, window replacement, or roof replacement. These type of projects do not generate reimbursement, because if you're requesting reimbursement, you must do a total renovation and bring the entire building up to today's code. So if a school board decides that they want to do a reimbursable project, they enter what's called the PlanCon process. The PlanCon history is, as I stated previously, PlanCon is an acronym for Planning and Construction Workbook. It was created in 1973. Sometimes people refer to some of the items in PlanCon, and I'll talk about in a minute. The Taj Mahal Act is a fairly important part of the PlanCon process. But the PlanCon process is an 11-step process from PlanCon A to PlanCon K. And the PlanCon documents are created to document a school district's planning process, provide justification for the project, make sure that the projects ascertain to today's codes, and it also shares with the community the type of reimbursement the school district may get with the option they select. So the current 11 steps of PlanCon, first, as we talked about, you have to do a district-wide facility study before you enter the PlanCon process. A school district cannot go out and say, we want to build a new elementary school. It's required by the Department of Education to do a district-wide facility study and create those construction options that I talked about. After the school board decides they want to proceed with the reimbursable project, they enter this process. So the first part is PlanCon Part I. These documents are simply worksheets. The important parts of PlanCon Part A is you're generating the capacity of buildings, how much the buildings will hold. You're looking at enrollment projections. You're making sure the building is not too large. And within that, you're also verifying that, in fact, the building that you want to proceed with qualifies for reimbursement. There's 2 steps in PlanCon Part A that are critical. You get reimbursed once every 20 years on a building, and also in PlanCon A, sheet A21, you have to make sure if you're doing a renovation project that the cost of alterations are more than 20% of the replacement value of that building. And that's an effort for Department of Education to make sure that the architect and the school board bring the existing building up to today's code. Part A and Part B are done together. Part B is simply a site plan drawing looking at circulation on the site, where the sidewalks are, driveways, et cetera. They're looking at how it all works, protecting the students in terms of being pedestrians and the vehicular traffic. And this is the first part of the advisory review with Department of Education. So we talk about that with the Department of Education. And so that's a drawing, and all of these parts of PlanCon are approved by the school board, presented to the school board prior to their submission to the Department of Education. PlanCon Part C is only required when a school district is interested in purchasing a new site. And the purpose of PlanCon Part C, again, these are worksheets. It's to verify that the cost of the property is competitive with other sites adjacent to that property the school district wants to acquire. PlanCon Part D is a very critical document. It's preliminary estimates of the project. And from PlanCon A to PlanCon Part D could take 3 to 4 months. Typically, PlanCon Part D is done with PlanCon Part E. PlanCon Part D are worksheets only. This is a critical document. Not only are you estimating the size of the project, but you're going through some calculations called Act 34 of 1973 to verify that any new building or any substantial addition, which is an addition that exceeds 20% of the existing building, do not go over the state average construction cost. So it prevents school boards and architects and contractors from designing and building buildings that are expensive. PlanCon E is the second review of the site plan drawings. They're more detailed. They're typically completed with input from the teaching staff, the administration, so it's just more detailed drawings. After PlanCon Part E, typically the architect goes back to his office and starts PlanCon Part F, which represents the construction documents. That is the drawings and specifications the contractors will use to build the building. To go from PlanCon E to PlanCon Part F takes 4 months alone, 4 months to do these detailed drawings. Those drawings are typically 150 pages of construction documents and 400 pages of specifications. You're reviewing some room schedules, and by the time you're done with PlanCon E, you know when you're going to receive bids, you know what the final design schedule is and what the construction schedule is. Then after PlanCon Part F, you advertise for bids, you receive bids from the contractors, you accept the low bid if that individual has the correct paperwork, that is bid bonds, and then after you receive bids and know the final cost, you do what's called PlanCon G, which is very similar to PlanCon D, which is the preliminary cost estimate. PlanCon G is the actual cost estimate based upon actual bid results. And again, these are just project worksheets. With the PlanCon G letter approval from Department of Education, you are eligible for reimbursement from the state. Then you move to PlanCon Part H. Again, these are worksheets. The majority of PlanCon H is done by the investment banker in the school district. You submit that to the school board, get approval, submit it to the state. Then after you get that approval from Department of Education, the school district is approved to receive reimbursement from the state. PlanCon I is completed during the construction process. This is a document, this is a part of PlanCon that Steve will briefly talk about that we would be interested in eliminating. This is for change orders. So if you have a project that the cost of all bids is $12 million, PlanCon I requires that once you exceed 3% or $300,000 in change orders, you have to get school board approval. So if it's a $12 million project, once you exceed $360,000 in change orders or $300,000, whichever is less, in this case $300,000 is less. Once you hit $300,000 in change orders, the regulations require that you go to the school board to get approval of the change order before you start proceeding with that change order. That creates many, many problems for the taxpayers in the school board and the school district. And Steve will talk about that briefly. Then finally, PlanCon J occurs probably 2 years after you're done with the project. Sometimes it takes 2 years. The project's completed, and you fill in all the final costs, the change orders, the final financing costs. You submit that to the state. And then lastly, PlanCon Part K, the 11th step is project refinancing. So now I'll turn it over to Steve, and he's going to talk about what we see as apparent problems with the existing PlanCon.
Thanks. Phil did a great job going through that. We go, when we meet with school boards, we take them through the PlanCon process, and everybody's eyes glaze over just like they did. It's a complex process, and I have to tell you, after hearing that, I can see why school board members get confused. There are many steps involved, and I just think to myself, how could I explain why we have so many steps, and why is the process so complex? And I was thinking to myself, my wife, when time comes up and she gets time available, she'll binge on TV and she'll watch like Veep or something for hours. Well, I just binged on 3 books that I read. One was The Last Days of Night, which was about the invention of the light bulb. And without spoiling the end, it's a very good book, and it's being made into a movie now. But just the takeaway is that it is about inventions and how these inventions improve our lives. And literally what PlanCon is trying to do is figure out how to fund better schools and improvements to schools for us. That's what the goal of it is. And why does it get so complex? Well, it is a process that makes sure that there's control over that spending and control over how it's spent, and that it drives at the educational purposes of the project. But it's been around since 1973. It's over 40 years old now. It hasn't really been polished up, hasn't caught up to current dates. And think of the light bulb. Well, our light bulbs today are a little better than they used to be, and they get polished up and improved all the time. We have to do the same thing with PlanCon. We're not going to do without light bulbs, and I don't think we're going to do without school funding. So we have to take the time to look at how we can improve PlanCon. For instance, we can eliminate some of the outdated requirements, and one of those that we mentioned is the requirement of microfilm. At the end of a project, we are still required to submit photographs of the documents to the Department of Education in microfilm in order for the schools to get reimbursed. I don't know how hard it is for anybody else to find somebody to do the microfiche processing or the microfilm processing, but it's not an easy thing to take care of. But that is just a simple example of how outdated the process is. So wouldn't it be great if Pennsylvania Department of Education just gave every school district half the cost of a school, and they gave it to them, right? No questions asked. Wouldn't that be great? That'd be a simple solution, right? But that's not how the process works. The process has been developed over many years, and it takes up to 12 to 18 months to get a school approved, because it is really in its simplest forms, and this is an important point I'd like to make, an agreement. PlanCon is an agreement between the school district and the Department of Education on reimbursement. That's the simplest explanation of what PlanCon is. It's an agreement, and within that agreement requires a lot of checks and balances, that you're getting the right approvals, you're maintaining the cost spending in the right way, and you're providing educational spaces that are eligible for reimbursement. To do that requires a lot of staff to check that the agreement is being abided by and that the process is being followed. PDE used to have maybe 10, 12 staff members that help process. It's about right, Jay, right? 10 or 12 people. They have literally one person, and I'm not exaggerating. It's down to one person that is processing the PlanCon documents that Phil described to you. Now, it requires time and energy to do all that review work, and with that, meetings and approval processes. Now, as architects, and if you can imagine inventors, because I'm on the inventor theme here, they look for ways to solve problems. Architects try and figure out how to work within this system that's been created, PlanCon, to help the school districts optimize their reimbursement. They look at the equations and the way that things can be reimbursed, and they figure out the best way to solve the problems of getting the most reimbursement for a school district. So they come up with creative solutions. But in some respects, those creative solutions are limited. We can only do so much within the construct of PlanCon. And some of the ideas that are being presented by educators today are not fully eligible for reimbursement in the way that we would like to do it. So our creativity is limited because PlanCon has not been updated to adapt to some of the trends in educational design, which you'll hear about later today. It also is a checks and balances that all the approval processes that are required for a school, land development approvals, all the waterways and stormwater requirements, and all the health safety requirements of building codes are also accomplished. We had a session similar to this with Pennsylvania School Boards Association to try and ferret out how to improve and what we can do with PlanCon. The school board members that were at that meeting last year brought up more often than not, the comments were about delays related to approval processes with government regulations. If we could help simplify that process and streamline that within PlanCon, because PlanCon, again, is acting as a gatekeeper of all the approvals and making sure that the agreements are maintained, that would be helpful. So some of our recommendations are that the school, the education department still provide reimbursement for school construction. Shifting the taxes to the local taxpayer is discussed regularly. That is simply a shift in taxes. Right now, there's a local share and a state share. No state share would be really not doing justice, and I don't know that it would be meeting the law of Pennsylvania either. But the local share, in many cases, always increases when they don't get a participation from the state. What we'd like to do is create and review this, the equations or the formulas for reimbursement to make sure that there's a fair and equitable distribution of reimbursement to the state, by the state. One of the other things we can do is simplify the process by combining, as Phil mentioned, parts A, B, and D. In most cases today, most architects and professionals run all three of those simultaneously in parallel in order to make sure that they're coordinated. Those three parts, if they are not coordinated, can cause delays. So typically we run that. If we could combine them into one step, there's certain elements of that are redundant. For instance, the calculations of the full-time equivalency capacities. You don't have to do it once, you wouldn't have to do it twice, and you'd be able to make sure that it aligns A, B, and D all together at the same time. And this is already being done around the state, as I mentioned. But that would eliminate 3 steps into one. There are a couple other repetitive steps. PlanCon E, that step is really another milepost in the review process with PlanCon as they check the agreement that is being maintained. That is a step that we think we could eliminate altogether. That was the design development phase, where you're, again, literally just repeating the steps that you had in PlanCon B and checking to make sure that you're in compliance with the agreement between the school district and the Department of Education. I is one that is a little tougher with the change orders, but we think we can eliminate that because the chances of that ever being raised, I think, are slim to none, and when it does occur, it really causes extra grief for everybody involved. We'd like to be able to eliminate that because it gets resolved in the end as the professionals are able to work that out through the process, and it could be eliminated. The PlanCon equations also, we'd like to be able to look at the new educational trends, which we'll cover later today, but being able to accommodate those are an important realm. If we can change the formulas to allow more spaces that we are using today for education that can become eligible as educational spaces for capacity reasons, then the equation for reimbursement could be more fluid and more dynamic and more creative as well. Right now, I think architects try and use their creativity to their maximum with workarounds, but we'd really like to change the system that would allow that creativity to occur and share in the reimbursement. The reimbursement formula will be able to be simplified with less steps, and then we can also just try and look at the basis of reimbursement right now, which is really based on equivalency of capacity, how many children can be educated in the building, and keep it very simple. Right now, there's a number of different types of capacity that are spoken about in the process, and we'd like to simplify that to just one type of capacity for educational benefits. So the final takeaway is, it is a process, just like any invention that is out there. It takes time and it takes improvement during time as it evolves. As changes come about, it takes effort to be able to make those changes, and here are just a few of them.
In closing, we just wanted to make some other brief comments about some other changes that should be considered that affects the school districts. That is, number one, there needs to be a process in terms of emergency projects where, for instance, as an example, if there's a roof leak in the main electrical distribution panel, the school district doesn't have time to put drawings together, advertise for bids, et cetera. So that needs reviewed. Also, Steve had mentioned there's only one architect now in the Department of Education. There used to be up to 6 architects when, at least I started this when I was a teenager. Now there's only 1. Another issue on renovation projects, we would like the opportunity for the school district and taxpayers to save money. That is so that we could bundle, if there's 2 renovation projects and you're doing them at the same time, to allow the contractors to bid both projects as one project. You can't do that if they're new buildings or substantial additions because of the Act 34 requirements. But on renovations, we would like to be able to do that. Currently, you cannot do that. The next 2 items, the State's Separations Act requires that you have 4 separate prime contractors for any project that is over $18,500. I know our firm and my colleagues who are sitting here, Vernon McKissick, Steve, and Dave Esposito from Eccles, the problem that happens with that is if we're hired to renovate a toilet room, the project's $21,000, and we have to have 4 prime contractors, general heating, plumbing, and electrical. What happens is you can't find an electrical contractor, you cannot find a plumbing contractor who wants to bid that project. It's too small. So that needs to be increased, we believe, up to around $500,000 or $1 million. Anything over $500,000, you would have general heating, plumbing, and electrical. And anything under $500,000, you could have one prime contractor. So the Separations Act causes a lot of problems for us in the school district because when you have a small project, you can't find the bidders. The last issue is the prevailing wage requirements, and this hasn't been changed for 54 years. So anything over $25,000, the taxpayers have to pay prevailing wage rates. We would like to see that dramatically increased again, perhaps evaluate 500,000 or $1 million. Anything under $500,000, a school district does not have to pay prevailing wage. So those are some thoughts that we had, and I'll turn it back over to Jay.
Thank you. We have an opportunity now with these two guys to ask any and all questions or start a dialogue if you wish. They have a lot more experience and a lot more stories they can share. Could I have anybody here interested in any questions whatsoever? Oh, come on now, people. Go ahead.
What's the status on PlanCon moratorium prospect for either implementing or lifting the moratorium?
These are the guys.
I would make a comment in this regard. There's currently Senate Bill 76 that is being evaluated. Within that document, there's an attachment that puts the moratorium back in place. So we're waiting to see what the Senate's going to do with Senate Bill 76, and the title of that is Elimination of Property Taxes, although at least my understanding of the issue is if that bill is passed, it still allows school districts to receive property taxes if they have debt. And if that bill passes, based upon my knowledge in meeting with some of the individuals in the Capitol, that bill also includes an increase in sales tax from 6% to 7%, in taxing clothes, everything. Many items will be taxed, along with the increase from 6 to 7, and they're also talking about increasing, with the passage of that bill, the personal income tax from 3.07 up to 4.95. So if that bill is passed, school districts with debt can still utilize property taxes to cover the tax increase. But attached to that Senate Bill 76 is another moratorium is set. So all this should start happening very soon with evaluation by the Senate, and then if it passes, it'll go to the House of Representatives.
That would be a major shift in the way schools are funded in Pennsylvania and how schools are paid for in Pennsylvania. It's be a radical change for many people, and the outcomes are really unpredictable.
All right, any other questions? Yes.
They're giving me a mic.
Yeah.
I have two. First one was sort of answered because I wanted to know at PDE what qualification that person had, and you did say that they're an architect, so that answered that question. So I just we had a 3-day retreat at Pennsylvania House of Republicans. I cannot tell you how many folks in that retreat wanted to completely eliminate the Pennsylvania Department of Education. So you're advocating for an increase in staffing. So at that PlanCon office, what would you see as optimal to try to eliminate this 12 to 18 weeks? Then I have another question.
I certainly think that you could double 1 to 2, but I would think 3 to 4 people could be able to handle the load that's coming down the pike right now. Certainly 2 would be better than 1.
I would also add, before that decision is made, the big picture item that needs to be decided is how are public schools going to be funded? How is this all going to happen? And then how is Department of Education going to interact to verify that certain procedures are followed so the taxpayers' money is spent in an efficient manner. So before we start increasing or decreasing Department of Education or eliminating the Department of Education, the first question is, how are we going to fund public schools? And then if you want some checks and balances, at least my personal belief is you will need the Department of Education to make sure that taxpayers are protected and make sure there's checks and balances. And then after that, the third decision would be how many people. And I would agree with Steve, at least another person who's a registered architect. And I think also the Jim Vogel's the gentleman we're talking about, and he's a registered architect. And perhaps on some of these presentations, he should be involved. He's quite familiar with the PlanCon process, along with the people on the panel and Dave Esposito. That would be my recommendation and comments.
Okay, second question, and because we had one of the requirements on change orders, 3% or 300,000. I also had a former hat I wore. I'm a former engineer, and change orders were money in the bank. I loved it when a customer said, "Hey, we need to make a change." And I don't know your business at all, buildings, but once I construct, have the design of a building, what change am I going to do that's going to result in $300,000? I have no idea.
Well, let me make a few comments in that regard. First of all, the requirements in public school design and public work is you do the drawings and specs, and then you are required to go with the low bidder. It's unlike private work. You do far less drawings, you get to pick your contractors, and you negotiate any changes as you proceed with the projects. In public work, you have change orders for 3 reasons: unforeseen conditions, owner-requested change orders, and architectural and engineering oversights. No architect or no engineer is perfect. Typically, Department of Education would tell you, if you ask the Department of Education on new construction, you can expect as an average on a $10 million project, $300,000 in change orders for those 3 reasons: unforeseen conditions, owner-requested change orders, and architectural and engineering oversights. On renovation projects, you can expect as an average in Pennsylvania 5% in change orders, which would be $500,000 on a renovation job that's $10 million. Although I've seen projects in school districts that have had 15% in change orders, and I've seen projects where there's 0.5%. So there's actually a contingency fund required in PlanCon D on page D03, because the Department of Education understands, because of the bidding environment, you will have change orders, period. And so we actually put in a line item for change orders during construction. So it's part of the bond issue when you do the project.
Legally, is that allowed in Pennsylvania?
The first part of the question is, how would we go about it? The recommendation that we have made is to increase the ceiling. Right now, it's very low, and it's impractical, in fact, at that level. Actually, we are recommending between $500 and $1 million as being the requirement. Above that, then you get contractors that can bid each of the portions of it. Because if you can imagine breaking it down into 4 primes, the pieces start to become pretty small, and the administrative costs become, for each contract, start to become a high percentage of each contract. So that's our recommendation, is to simply increase the level when it's required. As far as the co-op, is that how you described it? There are state contracts for certain things right now that do not, like furniture and equipment. I'm not sure. I think the law reads that construction must be bid. I don't know if there are any even roofing co-op opportunities that I know of. If anybody? correct
There
me
are
if I'm
some.
wrong.
There are some roofs.
So I think with the passage of Act 25 of 2016, there's a requirement in that act that on May 17th of this year, the advisory committee, which is made up of a number of people, we need to get in front of that entire committee and explain in far more detail than the time that we have here how the changes that we're talking about would dramatically help the taxpayers in Pennsylvania. So Act 25, 2016 was a critical act because it created a committee to analyze this PlanCon information. So we need to interact for long periods of time with that committee to talk about these issues